Introduction. Father Seraphim Rose and 21st Century Science by Philip E. Johnson. I first heard of Father Seraphim Rose in the summer of 1996 while lecturing in the Seattle area. A young man who had been in contact with the monks at the monastery of St. Herman in Platina, California, brought me a stack of books saying that the monks would like me to write an essay to accompany a collection of Father Seraphim's writings on Genesis and evolution. I had most of the books mailed to my office, but selected the slimmest one, Nihilism, to read on the trip. I was fascinated by the insight displayed in this early work and needed no urging to read later all the other materials I received, including Father Damascene Christensen's biography and the previously unpublished writings collected in this volume. Father Seraphim Rose believed in and lived by the teachings of the early Christian Church, but, or should I say, and therefore, he also thoroughly understood the problems of modernity. I am honored to have been invited to assist in bringing his teaching to the attention of a broader section of the public. My task is to review the state of the scientific questions today, to give the reader a sense of how well Father Seraphim's critique of evolutionary naturalism stands up now that a major reconsideration of Darwinism is beginning to occur in the secular world. I should explain first that my involvement with the subject of evolution has been quite different from his. Father Seraphim's primary objective was to explain the teaching of the Church Fathers, especially with respect to their understanding of the Scriptures, so that Orthodox believers would not be misled by misguided efforts to reinterpret those teachings in the light of modernist evolutionary science. He dealt with scientific questions mainly in the context of defending the patristic writings, and he directed his teaching toward fellow Orthodox believers. Although he understood the philosophical roots of evolutionary theory very profoundly, he was not extensively involved with the scientific community. He seems to have debated the subject only with Dr. Calomiros, who was apparently esteemed within part of the Orthodox community, but whose scientific views were confused and laden with misinformation. My own writings are addressed to the world at large, including secular intellectuals and religious believers from a variety of traditions. My writing and speaking brings me into constant debate with a variety of scientific authorities of greater and lesser renown. Most of my critics would not consider the Church Fathers to be reliable authorities, or even recognize their names. Many of them are also strongly prejudiced against anything that smacks of fundamentalism or even religion, and hence are repelled rather than persuaded by any reference to the Bible or its interpreters. To avoid endless confusion and distraction, and to keep attention focused on the most important point, I have firmly put aside all questions of biblical interpretation and religious authority in order to concentrate my energies on one theme. My theme is that, in Father Seraphim's words, evolution is not scientific fact at all, but philosophy. The philosophy in question is naturalism, the doctrine that nature is all there is, which for this purpose is identical to materialism, the doctrine that reality consists of nothing but the particles that physicists study. If materialism is true, then nature had to be capable of doing its own creating, and the existence of a materialistic evolutionary process follows as a matter of inevitable logic. Hence, I have argued, scientific materialists believe in naturalistic evolution not because of the evidence, but regardless of it. Although my own project has led me to avoid the questions of patristic authority that most concern Father Seraphim, some of my debating opponents have, like Dr. Calomiros, invoked the fathers in highly distorted form for their own purposes. I am therefore gratified to see that Father Seraphim has thoroughly demolished one of the favorite canards of accommodationists not only in Orthodoxy, but also in Roman Catholic and Protestant circles. Desperately seeking anything that will support their program of melding Christianity with evolutionary naturalism, these theologians and scientists have claimed that such esteemed fathers as Basil and Augustine taught a doctrine which is more or less like a primitive version of modern evolutionary theory. I need say no more on this subject because no one who understands Father Seraphim's lectures on Genesis and creation, which are contained in this volume, is in danger of being misled by such perverse misinterpretations. With those introductory comments out of the way, I will explain certain common misunderstandings of the scientific issues with which Father Seraphim had to deal, and in the course of doing this, I will attempt to bring his discussion up to date. Father Seraphim's thought was thoroughly at odds with 20th century science, shaped as that science has been by its a priori commitment to metaphysical materialism. It may well be, however, that the science of the next century will be more modest and hence more realistic, in which case he may seem like a man who was far ahead of his time. What is evolution? A succinct and accurate definition of evolution, as the term is understood by today's mainstream scientists and science educators, is given in the official USA 1995 policy statement of the National Association of Biology Teachers. The diversity of life on Earth is the outcome of evolution, an unsupervised, impersonal, unpredictable and natural process of temporal descent with genetic modification that is affected by natural selection, chance, historical contingencies, and changing environments. This definition contains three elements. 1. Evolution is an unsupervised and impersonal process, that is, it is not directed or guided by God. 2. Evolution is a natural process of descent with modification by which all of today's living organisms descended by a natural process from a single primordial ancestor which itself evolved without supernatural assistance from non-living chemicals. And 3. The mechanism of evolution is a combination of random genetic changes or chance and natural selection operating in the context of historical contingencies and changing environments. I will discuss these three elements below in reverse order. As a preliminary matter, however, I should firmly correct one of Dr. Calomiros' many misunderstandings. Not every instance of change in nature constitutes evolution, as that term is used today. The growth of a giant oak tree from an acorn is not evolution, nor is the development of a human baby from an embryo in the womb of its mother. These processes of what biologists call development are fundamentally different from biological evolution because they are programmed by the information inherited from the parents and hence are highly predictable. A human embryo never grows into some animal other than a human being, and an acorn never turns aside from its programmed path to become a pine tree or a rose bush. There is a persistent legend among evolutionists that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, that is, that the development of the human infant in the womb is a kind of a rerun of evolutionary history, as the embryo goes from a fish stage to a reptile stage, and so on. This non-existent phenomenon is often called Haeckel's law, after Darwin's most prominent German disciple. In another form, the law states that the embryo goes through not the adult stages, but the embryonic forms of earlier ancestral forms. In either form, the law does not exist and is not defended by qualified embryologists in the professional literature. One can, however, find stages evident here and there of characteristics that, with imagination, can be made to fit the pattern of Haeckel's law, and these are continually cited to the public in popular treatments of proof of evolution. The most famous example is the supposed gill slits possessed by human embryos at one stage of development, although these slits are not gills and never develop into gills. Although Haeckel's law was discredited many decades ago, it has such an irresistible appeal to the Darwinian imagination that it is still taught in many schools around the world. Even reputable museums and universities continue to propagate a version of it in a vague and unfalsifiable form. For example, the online Paleontology Museum at the University of California at Berkeley has this to say about Haeckel's law. The law of recapitulation has been discredited since the beginning of the 20th century. Experimental morphologists and biologists have shown that there is not a one-to-one correspondence between phylogeny and ontogeny. Although a strong form of recapitulation is not correct, phylogeny and ontogeny are intertwined, and many biologists are beginning to both explore and understand the basis for this connection. In fact, research into embryology has shown that it is a tightly directed process which does not fit the Darwinian paradigm at all. Efforts to alter the process by inducing mutations can produce deformities of various sorts, but they do not succeed in changing the path of development so that the embryo develops into a viable creature of a different type. 1. The mechanism of evolution, mutation and selection. At bottom, biological evolution is a theory of change which undertakes to explain how it is possible for one kind of organism to change into something completely different. It also seeks to explain how extremely complex biological organs and organisms can come into existence without the need for a supernatural creator. As the eminent Darwinist Richard Dawkins has explained, biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Nonetheless, Dawkins says that Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist by explaining how a mindless material mechanism could perform the apparent miracle of biological creation. The mechanism is therefore the heart of the theory, as Darwin himself explained. In considering the origin of species, it is quite conceivable that a naturalist, reflecting on the mutual affinities of organic beings, on their embryological relations, their geographical distribution, geological succession, and such other facts, might come to the conclusion that each species had not been independently created, but had descended like varieties from other species. Nevertheless, such a conclusion, even if well-founded, would be unsatisfactory until it could be shown how the innumerable species inhabiting this world have been modified so as to acquire that perfection of structure and co-adaptation which most justly excites our admiration. In other words, simply postulating that change has occurred, or that primitive species are ancestors of modern species, is not much of an improvement over special creation unless a mechanism of change is specified. Our experience is that like begets like. An ape never gives birth to a human or vice versa, and it is still more unthinkable that a bacterium would give birth to a butterfly. So how does one kind of organism change into something completely different? Above all, how does this process of change build new complex organs, like eyes, wings, kidneys, and brains, which did not exist before? The origin of the human mind is, of course, the ultimate problem, and Dawkins acknowledges the scope of the problem. Physics books may be complicated, but the objects and phenomena that a physics book describes are simpler than a single cell in the body of its author, and the author consists of trillions of those cells, many of them different from each other, organized with intricate architecture and precision engineering into a working machine capable of writing a book. Each nucleus contains a digitally coded database larger in information content than all 30 volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica put together. And this figure is for each cell, not all the cells of the body put together. How does an unsupervised material process create such an intricate marvel, which is far more complex than a computer or a spaceship? The Darwinian answer is that tiny changes, the sort of variations that appear in each generation and differentiate a juvenile organism from its parents, accumulate gradually over many generations until they produce an entirely new kind of creature with new organs and adaptive features. This mechanism has never been shown to be capable of generating anything other than minor variations, such as back and forth variations in the size of finch beaks, or variations in the relative frequency of light and dark varieties in a moth population. Footnote: although the peppered moth experiment never proved anything of importance, readers should know that the experiment itself was the result of Darwinian enthusiasm. End of footnote. Because it is the only naturalistic possibility that has any plausibility whatever, Darwinists extrapolate wildly from these trivial examples to postulate a mechanism capable of creating countless adaptive wonders, including even the human brain. Such claims are poorly supported, to put it mildly, and in recent years they have come up against insuperable negative evidence. The details are given in my book Darwin on Trial and in various articles which are collected at my website. Very briefly, two independent lines of evidence are decisive. 1. Fossil stasis. The fossil record is pervasively characterized by a pattern of sudden appearance followed by stasis. New types of organisms appear suddenly and fully formed, and they remain basically unchanged thereafter. This pattern can be used to support the proposition that creation occurred not just at the beginning, but throughout Earth's history, assuming the dating of the rocks is accurate. But it consistently refuses to support the key Darwinian claim that one kind of creature changes step by step into something completely different. This pattern of evidence cannot be attributed to any incompleteness in the fossil record, because the pattern is most obvious and undeniable in just those areas, especially marine invertebrates, where the record is most complete. The very anti-Darwinian state of the fossil record was known to insiders all along as the trade secret of paleontology, but it first came to the attention of the general public in the 1980s due to the publicity given to the theory of evolution by punctuated equilibria. This theory attempted to reconcile Darwinism with the pattern of sudden appearance and stasis by supposing that significant evolution occurs in small groups which go away from the unchanging main population, accumulate mutations, and then reappear as a new species without leaving a trace of the transformation in the fossil record. By this means, the absence of evidence for evolution became transformed into evidence for invisible evolution. In the memorable 1995 words of Niels Eldredge, one of the founders of the punctuated equilibria theory, evolution cannot forever be going on somewhere else. Yet that's how the fossil record has struck many a forlorn paleontologist looking to learn something about evolution. As Eldridge's remark implies, this spectacular pattern of fossil disconfirmation persists even after more than a century of determined efforts by Darwinist paleontologists to find evidence that will support their cherished theory. Any doubtful fossil that could conceivably be interpreted as an intermediate form in a Darwinian transition has been cited as proof that Darwinism is true, and yet, even after these heroic efforts, the bulk of the fossil record is as thoroughly inconsistent with Darwinian expectations as it was when Darwin proposed the theory in 1859. 2. Irreducible complexity. A 1996 book by molecular biologist Michael B. has brought to public attention the fact that biological systems at the molecular level are irreducibly complex. This means that they are made up of many complicated parts and subsystems, all of which have to be in place in order for the system as a whole to perform a useful function. In other words, these intricate systems cannot be built up step by step as the Darwinian theory requires, and molecular biologists do not even attempt to present detailed scenarios of how evolution might have produced them. As with the pervasive stasis in the fossil record, irreducible complexity at the molecular level has long been known to specialists but has been kept from public attention because biologists did not know how to explain it within a Darwinian framework. This illustrates the phenomenon famously described by Thomas Kuhn. Facts which do not fit the dominant scientific paradigm tend to be systematically ignored because they are a distraction from the prevailing research agenda. When they are faced with the devastating evidence against the Darwinian mechanism and reminded of the lack of positive evidence in its favor, Darwinists tend to retreat to what they think is a more defensible line. They distinguish between Darwin's specific theory, which they admit to be vulnerable, and something they call the fact of evolution, which they claim to be undeniably true. That takes me to the second subject. 2. The common ancestry thesis. The difference between the supposedly undeniable fact of evolution and Darwin's theory is obscure for the very good reason that the mere existence of a pattern of relationship has no great significance unless there is a theory that explains how the pattern came into existence. The fact is usually described as common ancestry, which is the proposition that humans and other animals share a common ancestor with plants and fungi and bacteria. The supposed proof of the fact is that living things exist in groups, and the groups are related by a pattern of greater and lesser similarity. Humans are similar in many ways to apes, somewhat less similar to rabbits, less similar still to snakes, still less similar to trees, and so on. All of the disparate groups of the taxonomic order, bacteria, plants, animals, etc., have a common biochemical basis, indicating that they come from a common source. The Darwinian explanation of this pattern is that it results from common ancestry, with those groups having the greatest degree of similarity being the ones with relatively recent common ancestors. In reality, the common ancestors are postulates in a theory which aims to explain the fact of classification or relationship. Ancestry implies a very gradual process of change, since offspring differ only slightly in each generation from their parents. Hence, the common ancestry thesis implies not only that the common ancestors existed on the earth, but also that very long lines of gradual descent linked these ancient ancestors to their putative modern descendants. None of this can be confirmed from fossil studies, but Darwinists believe that the process must have occurred nonetheless, because they think it is the only scientific, that is, naturalistic, explanation for the pattern of life. On the contrary, a pattern of greater and lesser similarities, or of variations within a basic type, is more likely to be evidence of a common design plan rather than of a natural evolutionary process. This was inadvertently demonstrated in a 1990 book by a Darwinist zoologist who illustrated the fact of evolution by citing the example of a line of automobiles. Everything evolves in the sense of descent with modification, whether it be government policy, religion, sports cars, or organisms. The revolutionary fiberglass Corvette evolved from more mundane automotive ancestors in 1953. Other high points in the Corvette's evolutionary refinement included the 1962 model, in which the original 102-inch was shortened to 98 inches, and the new closed coupe Stingray model was introduced. The 1968 model, the forerunner of today's Corvette morphology, which emerged with removable roof panels, and the 1978 silver anniversary model with fastback styling. Today's version continues the stepwise refinements that have been accumulating since 1953. The point is that the Corvette evolved through a selection process acting on variations that resulted in a series of transitional forms and an end point rather distinct from the starting point. A similar process shapes the evolution of organisms. Of course, the Corvettes, like the organisms, have common features because they were conceived in the mind of a designer, and not because some mindless process made either one. In other words, the fact of relationship is not evidence of the existence of a purely naturalistic or mindless mechanism of creation. Beethoven's symphonies follow the pattern of common design with variations, but this pattern has no tendency whatever to support a theory that the symphonies compose themselves without any help from Beethoven. Evolutionary theory today is in a state of confusion in which major figures like Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Dawkins disagree violently over how evolution is supposed to have occurred. These warring ideologues do have a common program of sorts, but it is a philosophical program rather than a scientific program. What they agree on is that, at all costs, God must be kept out of the picture. That brings us to the third and most important part of the definition of evolution. 3. Evolution, in the scientific sense, is inherently godless. We saw that the NABT definition states that evolution is by definition unsupervised. This requirement is not a conclusion that Darwinists reach from empirical evidence, but a philosophical assumption that reflects their starting point in a metaphysical naturalism or materialism. If nature is all there is, then nature had to be able to do its own creating. That implies the existence of a naturalistic evolutionary process capable of making very complex things from simple beginnings. The process must be unguided at first because a mind capable of guiding evolution would itself have to evolve from non-living matter. Once human beings have evolved, of course, evolution can become a guided process through practice of eugenics and genetic engineering. Given these assumptions, something at least roughly like Darwinism simply has to be true, regardless of the evidence. Evolution has to start with chance or random changes, and it has to have some mindless guiding force capable of producing the wonders of complex engineering that we call organisms. That is why Richard Dawkins has argued in lectures that if complex life exists on other planets, Darwinian evolution would have to be responsible for it. There is no need for evidence or observations, because the Darwinian mechanism is the only plausible candidate for the job, given the starting point in naturalism. This logic explains why Darwinists are unperturbed by all the evidentiary problems that critics such as myself have identified. The theory has to be true regardless, because otherwise we would be without a materialistic explanation for life's complexity, and we would have to turn to God. This logic has been succinctly encapsulated in a paragraph from a 1997 essay by the leading geneticist Richard Lewontin. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but, on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. There is no need to say more. We can see the profound truth of Father Seraphim's comment that evolution would never have been thought of by men who believe in the God whom Orthodox Christians worship. Once the divine foot is in the door, there is no reason to postulate either legions of unobservable fossil ancestors or a mindless material process that performs wonders of creation. For conclusion, can science tell us a true story about origins? Criticism of evolutionary theory, however valid, cannot answer the most important question. If we wish to know the truth about origins, should we rely primarily upon divine revelation or scientific investigation? Father Seraphim, like many creationists, believed that science was impotent when it comes to the subject of ultimate origins, and that true knowledge on this subject can only come from revelation. His reason was that the events of the Genesis creation week took place under a unique set of laws which were entirely different from those which have operated since the fall. If true, that conclusion implies that the entire subject of origins is outside of scientific investigation. Science can only observe what is going on in the world today and can draw inferences about the remote past only by assuming a uniformity over time of physical processes and physical laws. That is why evolutionary scientists, for example, assume that the process that created plants and animals in the first place is fundamentally the same process of small-scale variation we can observe today in the living world. There may be little evidence to support that assumption, but without it a science of origins would be helpless. Conceivably, there may have been some very un-Darwinian creative evolutionary process operating in the distant past, which employed mechanisms which are no longer in operation today. Such a process would be nearly as unacceptable to scientific materialists as outright creationism, because a mechanism which is in principle unobservable is as inaccessible to scientific study as a miracle. Science could discard the Darwinian theory without serious loss if there were at hand another materialistic theory, one likewise based on uniformitarian and naturalistic assumptions. But what if there is no alternative theory, or at least no theory with enough factual support to command widespread acceptance? Scientists who want to explain everything will always insist on making assumptions that permit them to achieve their grand objective, and they will always be extremely reluctant to admit that their methods may be inadequate to explain the mysteries of creation. Science does not like to tolerate rival ways of understanding, and hence ambitious scientists will bitterly denounce those religious thinkers who raise the possibility that physical laws and processes have profoundly changed since the time of creation. Father Seraphim was not intimidated by that sort of denunciation, nor should others be. Uniformitarianism, like naturalism, is a philosophical assumption, not a fact. It is perfectly rational to make other assumptions, including assumptions that point to the conclusion that we can only have knowledge about origins if God has chosen to reveal it to us.